My brothers and sisters, I would urge us not to be involved in conspiracy approaches, even to the point, it's almost unbelievable, that somehow the General Conference and the World Church is receiving instructions and is under the thumb or the direction of the United Nations. That, to me, is complete fallacy. We have no instructions from the United Nations. We have no directives. We have nothing. We are not in contact with the United Nations, except we have a representative that works with other non-government organizations to help in humanitarian areas, to help in health challenges, to help in religious liberty aspects. So my brothers and sisters, I think the record needed to be shared and set straight.
Now we'll take a bit of time to look at this gentleman, Dr. John Nusbalm. He attended, along with Arthur Maxwell, which I believe is the same Arthur Maxwell who does the Uncle Arthur stories. They attended a 1931 meeting with the League of Nations to argue against the adoption of the world calendar. All right, so since 1931, he was involved in the matter of religious liberty, specifically through this world calendar effort. John Nusbalm was then supported in his religious liberty work. Why? Because the Catholic Church was also against this world calendar, by Cardinal Pacelli, who later became Pope Pius XII. And then in 1945, John Nusbalm is then involved in meetings that lead to the formation of the UN. So how does a Seventh-day Adventist physician suddenly become so important, so a man of such stature that he can be involved in meetings that leads to the formation of the United Nations? Well, the answer to that is, and again, he has a Wikipedia page. It's in French, so maybe James can read it. But these days, the browsers can translate it for you. John Nusbalm married a certain lady who was the niece of the Prime Minister of Serbia. And through this marriage, he became involved in diplomatic circles. And it is his exposure to diplomatic circles where he really developed a diplomatic and statesman-like nature about him. But then also, how did he get involved with the formation of the United Nations? Well, he established a close friendship with Eleanor Roosevelt, and that gave him a lot of prominence. So it's he was married to political connections. He became accustomed to diplomacy, and he must have been very effective in what he did to impress Eleanor Roosevelt. And we'll see that she knew him quite well and supported him quite well. But now also we go from Carlisle B. Haynes to John Nusbalm to now we're here with another personality, B.B. Beach. And we'll talk more about B.B. Beach later on. But B.B. Beach and Arthur Maxwell were SDAs chosen to attend the Vatican II Council. And Vatican II was about ecumenism. So now we're starting to see a few themes develop around these personalities and their pursuit of engagement with the United Nations. Now, John Nusbalm, in his own words, wrote that we are implementing ecumenism. And he said it's a very special type and it's in a very comprehensive way. We are not only appealing to the Christians in the world, but also to the believers of all religions. So it's not even an ecumenism limited to Christianity. And that really is starting to betray the reasons for concern with this United Nations status. Is this need to accommodate believers of all religions or no religion at all. Now, this friendship between Nusbalm and Eleanor Roosevelt is so apparent that even Eleanor Roosevelt in her diary wrote on May 24, 1954, she said, Dr. John Nusbalm and I became acquainted during the first session of the United Nations in London. He represents a number of small religious groups in Europe. As far as I can see, he covered the world in the interests of freedom of religion for such small groups as the Seventh-day Adventist. I find him an interesting reporter on world conditions. So no doubt that Eleanor Roosevelt was a good friend of Nusbaum. She was quite impressed by him. And then this religious liberty motivation, a friendship with Eleanor Roosevelt, it drove the pursuit of UN status, and it incurred ecumenism. And the acknowledgement of the strong relationship between Eleanor Roosevelt and John Nusbaum is then found in the organization that he established, the International Association for the Defense of Religious Liberty, which Eleanor Roosevelt was actually the first president. And then this Eleanor Roosevelt, as well as Albert Schweitzer, who was the second president of this organization, they were also founding members and supporters of the Temple of Understanding, which was set up by Lucis Trust. Those who are familiar with Lucis Trust and Alice A. Bailey. And today, this organization, the International Association for the Defense of Religious Liberty, has an award called the John Nusbaum and Eleanor Roosevelt Award. And yeah, this organization itself has been given recognition by the Secretary General of the United Nations as a peace messenger in 1987. So it is obviously a member, or it's in status with the United Nations. And this organization has its annual, well, I don't know if it's annual, but it has an award ceremony. And I was just chuckling when I saw that the former director of Paul Ganun Diop was handing out these awards, but right at the very end, one of the recipients had to call him back and say, Ganun Diop, you've also won the same award. For Paul to be awarding itself an award for me was a bit of a cause for chuckle. But really, this word status with the United Nations is so fit to describe, because a lot of this seems to be about status, giving awards and maintaining an appearance. So we spoke a bit about John Nusbaum, but John Nusbaum handed the torch to this gentleman, B.B. Beach. Now, I'd probably also go by the initials if my second name was Beverly, but he is considered an Adventist statesman, here proudly proclaimed in the Adventist Review. And as this statesman, Reinder Brainsma, who those who know will know, anything that Reinder is enthusiastic about is probably not good for the Reformation. He has chosen this photo where B.B. Beach is greeting the Pope. And during this greeting the Pope, he also handed a gold medallion to the Pope. And on that medallion was a symbol of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And this is published in the Adventist Review of 1977. So for me, these are, I don't know if it's just me, but I would think this is cause for concern that we have Adventists trying to endear themselves to the Pope. He wrote a book, Vatican II, Bridging the Abyss. We saw earlier that he was commissioned to attend Vatican II. So he also then follows that book up with writing Ecumenism, Boon or Bane. From my naive understanding is that ecumenism would always be a bad idea, but he wanted to argue that it could be a boon. Now we we start moving into so we've kind of journeyed through history. We start moving towards this application for status. And as I mentioned, unfortunately, we've got that data gap in the General Conference session minutes. So the only leads and clues we can find are in the General Conference committee minutes. And even there's very sparse reference to what's happening here. So all we really can see is that in 1980, J.J. Aitken announced that Robert Mueller, who was the Undersecretary of the United Nations, and he was the Secretary of the Economic and Social Council, will be the guest speaker at the annual ASI. So here, the UN comes to address ASI. In 1981, we see that B.B. Beach was reporting on the human rights resolution that has been before the United Nations. So he's clearly managing that relationship. In 1982, he again supplies a report on the work at the United Nations. And then in March 21, 1985, Lowell L. Bock announces that it's been approved for the Economic and Social Cultural Council of the United Nations to recommend to the Council that consultative status be afforded to the General Conference of the Seventh-day Adventists. So clearly in this, the preceding months or years, from 1980 up until March 21, 1985, somewhere the General Conference should have submitted a application through Paul for this status. And here in March 21, it is then it's now being recommended by the Economic, Social and Cultural Council of the United Nations for GC to be afforded that status. And then we arrive at the proud announcement that, it's been concluded. So we'll find that here in the Adventist Review, in June 27, 1985, Neil C. Wilson, who was the president of the General Conference, he then announces that on May 10, the United Nations recognized the General Conference of Seventh-day Adventists as an NGO in consultative status with the Economic and Social Council of the United Nations. But we also notice that this personality, Neil C. Wilson, he also speaks very positively of Bert Beach, who we saw was this ecumenist. So he then acknowledges here that Bert wrote Ecumenism, Boon or Bane, and this is in a bit of a eulogy of Bert Beach, which was published in December of 2022. And the General Conference president of that time, Neil C. Wilson, commended Beach as having done a superb job in the writing or in ecumenism itself. I'm not sure whether it's in the writing of the book or whether it was in the ecumenism itself that Bert Beach had done a superb job. But we can see Neil Wilson was very supportive of this pursuit of ecumenism and the United Nations. And then also we see that Neil C. Wilson, from the president, was proud to announce that Robert Mueller, the Associate Secretary of the United Nations, was a featured speaker at ASI in 1981. So it's clear that this was happening with Neil C. Wilson very aware of what is happening in terms of Paul, the United Nations, and the cementing of relationships there. Which then leads to us really having to question, how is it possible that at the General Conference session of 2025, Elder Ted Wilson, who was the president of the General Conference at that time, but not only the president of the General Conference, he's the son of Neil C. Wilson, how he can say that there is nothing with the United Nations. Now, I don't know if the sharing is such that I can play this embedded video clip, James.
Yeah, go ahead, try it.
Let's give it a go. Okay, I'm hearing nothing.
Yeah, can you try to share your sound when you share your screen?
Yeah. Yep. And you're saying advanced sharing options, would that be there? Look, I think let's skip it. It's gonna be too much of a chore. It's been used in other presentations that I've done.
Okay.
So it was just troubling to see him deny that there's anything with the United Nations when we can see that his father was very proud of the fact that there was status achieved with the United Nations. He himself has met with the Secretary General of the United Nations, yet he goes and stands here and says there's nothing with the United Nations. But as we saw on our very first slide of this presentation, it said cooperation without compromise. It was stunning to see his perspective on this status with the United Nations. And we also see that there's many indicators that actually the United Nations is successful in influencing the church, and none more apparent than the dangers of climate change, where this official statement basically claims that the world membership of the Seventh-day Adventist Church is calling on governments to implement UN Agenda 21, which is now UN Agenda 2030. Now, this then forces me to consider, is there a situation of deliberate duplicity? Now, those of you who know the work of SDA Pearl, you'll be familiar with our efforts on the 2015 immunization statement, which at General Conference 2025 led to the unveiling of a whole new version, which was attempting to circumvent our most obvious objection. And again, you can go and watch the Augusta, Maine religious liberty presentations. The very first one I did, well, I dealt with what transpired at the General Conference. But what we have there is that there were actually two versions. There was one version that says the health message is based on science, and then there was another version that says the health message is only informed by science. Now, both statements are still objectionable, and we will continue to reject them in business meetings. And if you need more information, just stay tuned, because we'll get to that at the end. But they claimed to not have known that they had published the wrong version for more than 10 years, even though in the reaffirmation statement, they referenced a document, and that document verbatim copied what they claim to be the wrong version. So how can you reaffirm knowingly the wrong version? It suggests it's deliberate duplicity. They want to cause confusion over what they actually claim the health message is based on, such that if members push, they can say, no, it's just informed by. But in all actuality, what they really want is they want the claim that it's based on science, because they believe science is the only thing that can safeguard them in a liability situation. Now, we find another example of this deliberate duplicity in the abortion stance. So George Gaynor had done sterling work on this, and one of his articles is published in Ministry Magazine, and you can go and search for it in those Adventist archives, or just on the Adventist.org website. You can just go and search for it. But he really makes the case that there was deliberate duplicity regarding the stance of the church leadership on abortion. So they would publish in 1970 a fairly conservative position on abortion. However, they knew that the hospitals won't be too happy with that, because that would not enable them to pursue what could be a lucrative endeavor in terms of willful termination of pregnancy. So then in 1971, another set of guidelines was published, which is more liberal. And then when church members were asking themselves, where does the church stand on abortion? Then the 1970 guidelines is what you see, but what is actually being practiced is the 1971 guidelines, which is really based on very humanistic consideration. Notably here in the 1971 guidelines, there was a guideline number 5, which says, when for some reason the requirements of functional human life demand the sacrifice of the lesser potential human value, abortion is permitted. Now, this is a case of them knowingly wanting to allow doctors to play God. And nowhere do you read that we'll trust God. God has designed birth. He has designed the female body. And I'm not saying these aren't tough decisions. I'm just saying opening the door to choosing to sacrifice what is deemed the lesser life, that is an issue theologically. And the duplicity was maintained, and George Gaynor said that the reason for maintaining this duplicity for 16 years and more was very clear. It has allowed the church to present to its own clergy and laity and to the general public as well a restrictive stance toward abortion based on what was published in May 13, 1917. But at the same time, it allowed the church to permit its hospitals a free hand in the economically significant practice of abortion on demand on the basis of the unpublished 1971 interruption of pregnancy guidelines. So that already shows that there's been a history of duplicity on contentious issues where a certain face is presented to the laity, the membership of the church, and a very different face is presented to the outside world. And a very revealing comment also from this personality, Neil C. Wilson, is coming from 1970. And I've actually found the Religious News Services quote, the article there, where this quote derives from. And Pro-Life Andrew, you can watch his channel on YouTube. He helped me find that article. I had struggled to track down the quote because I don't want to deal with manufactured quotes. But this is a proven quote. So Neil C. Wilson, at that time the president of the North American division, says, though we walk the fence, Adventists lean toward abortion rather than against it, because we realize that we are confronted by big problems of hunger and overpopulation. We do not oppose family planning and appropriate endeavors to control population. Now, what troubles me with this quote is the restrictive guidelines were the usual stuff, a conception due to rape or incest or imminent loss of life to the mother. Very restrictive. Now, none of those points are mentioned here in this quote. What is revealed in this quote is the big problems of hunger and overpopulation. Now, according to the Bible, the command was, be fruitful and multiply. God didn't say, but at some point we've got to start managing the population. God said, be fruitful and multiply. Sustainability is not a problem for God. However, sustainability is the problem for the United Nations. So seeing the president, the future General Conference president, lean towards abortion in his sentiments for the sake of sustainability considerations reveals United Nations program. It reveals Malthusian thinking. That is a huge concern. Now, we then see this deliberate duplicity also practiced in the area of ecumenism. Now, here in ecumenism, we can't find any guidance on the General Conference website. So they didn't put ecumenism, boon or bane there as the Bible regarding ecumenism. But there is one statement. one statement on the ecumenical movement, and it acknowledges that we have no official statement on it. So they've deliberately left it in a gray area. And as such, it is just whatever is not prohibited is permitted. So those who want to pursue ecumenism are free to do it. And we find then actually, and again, I don't think the audio will play, but in a presentation done here in Huntsville, Alabama, Gannon Diop says, okay, I'm going to shock you now, because yes, are you in ecumenism? And I say, yes, I am. I mean that on purpose. Because yes, he's unashamed that he indeed is practicing ecumenism. And we've seen that, Bert Beach is unashamed that he's practicing ecumenism. And John Grass, who followed up Bert Beach, practiced ecumenism. So after looking at this, we've got to acknowledge that the Public Affairs and Religious Liberty Department needs to be rebranded to more accurately reflect its contribution. And it needs to be called the Ecumenism and New World Order Department of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, because they are pursuing ecumenism and status with the United Nations, which is the New World Order organization. In terms of religious liberty, Paul has failed, as we saw in the reaffirmation statement, where the Public Affairs and Religious Liberty Department of the General Conference, they regarded COVID-19 as a public health crisis, and they viewed any connection with vaccines accordingly. So therefore, they deemed vaccines is not a religious liberty issue. They determined that it is important that the church preserve its ability to speak to issues that are central to its beliefs, and that its influence not be diluted by pursuing personal convictions and agendas that are not central to its gospel and prophetic concerns. So Paul, which should stand for religious liberty, completely excused themselves from the question of mandates during the pandemic, which was the biggest religious liberty issue worldwide in recent history. So given their failure, their profound failure to appreciate what is a religious liberty issue, given their failure to expend energy in safeguarding our religious liberty, therefore, I say they should be defunded and they should be rebranded as something more befitting their actual agenda, which is ecumenism and pursuing the New World Order aims and goals. Now here we just had the General Conference president, the new one, and he was saying that he's aware that an organization like the General Conference can become too big, and then it can create risks to navigate a complex organization like a General Conference, which could involve celebrating achievements that aren't part of our mission. And I'm listening to what he's saying there, and I'm asking myself, is this a self-awareness fail? Because he's talking about it like theoretically that could happen, but it's literally has been happening. And he was a secretary of the General Conference. He was very much part of the previous regime, and he failed to, at that time, address any of these issues. He then does a wonderful work by defining our mission during his sermon at the General Conference session, which is the three angels' message, and I fully agree with him. But for some reason, they insist on encouraging immunization based on science. There's no other basis to encourage it, and on supporting the UN agenda. As I've shown with this dangers of climate change statement, they literally support and desire the implementation of the United Nations agenda. Now, why are we doing that? If he was truly wanting the church to be grounded in scripture and focused on the mission, he should address these matters in the General Conference. I get the sense that, these sermons are very nice to keep the membership all focused on the mission, where the leadership are pursuing other agendas. Again, the sermon at the General Conference session rings hollow if ADRA continues to carry the Adventist name, when in fact on their website they say that they do not proselytize. So how are they focused on the mission if they proudly proclaim that they do not proselytize? They are celebrating achievements apart from fulfilling the mission, because the mission is to proselytize through the spreading of the three angels' message. But ADRA also is actually in general status with the United Nations Economic and Social Council, and they recently again committed to the Sustainable Development Goals, and they proudly proclaim it. So it's clear that ADRA also is promoting the United Nations agenda.